we estimated how much metals we actually need between now and 2050 to ensure that we actually are able to build all these technologies. And what the numbers are saying is that between now and today, in order to build all those wind turbines, in order to build all those solar PVs, in order to build all those electric vehicle batteries, we need to sell metals worth $10 trillion. And I don't know what Africa's current GDP is. I'm assuming somewhere in the trillion, 1 trillion. But then if you think about the fact that we have to sell metals 10 times what our current GDP is, that is an enormous opportunity in order for us to reach net zero. But then there's always a but. What is the status quo for Africa? And over the next couple of slides, whenever I make a point, I always try to leave the most important point I will talk about in that purple line there. So even if you forget anything I say the next 5 minutes, I want you to take home the fact that Africa currently does not have downstream capacity. So how did we determine this? First of all, we looked at the opportunity, like I said, and I'm going to single it down to battery, given that is going to be the focus of the panel today. And we looked at how much the market of all these segments between rock and battery is actually going to be worth by 2035. And you can see here that if you're on the extreme left, which is the mining part, is about $11 billion. And if you're able to go further downstream to the electric vehicle part, it's about $7 trillion. And before I continue, I always like to have dialogue with the audience. So I'm going to ask a question. So let's just assume all of you, we are in the United Nations General Assembly, all of you represent a country here. And I asked you, if you had the power as a president of your country to choose which part of this value chain you would want to focus on, where would you focus on? I'll probably start mentioning names. Tapiwa from Zimbabwe, where would you choose? Electric vehicles, simply because of the market value there, which is about $7 trillion. But then, what has been the historical focus for African countries and African companies? Most of Africa's focus has always been on the 11 billion part. And over the last 100 years, increasingly the focus of Africa's industry has always been on the extreme left part. But then I'm here to say that we think, given the fact that this is an emerging industry and there are currently no winners, neither are there losers, what could Africa actually gain? We think there's opportunity for Africa to move all the way from the mining to what my colleague from Zimbabwe talked about. So what would it take to build Africa's downstream opportunity? What would it take to move from 11 billion to 7 trillion? To be able to do that, we conducted a study at Bloomberg NEF where we ranked 30 different countries across 5 important metrics. So we asked ourselves, for example, do you have raw materials in your country? Do you have battery manufacturing capacity in your country? What is your ESG credentials? Also, have you got the right industry and infrastructure to support it? And let's just imagine that you produce the batteries. Do you have people that are going to buy them? So we looked at all these factors across 30 different countries, including 3 African countries. And I want to first start with those who came out as top 3. And I don't know if anyone wants to take a guess who are the top 3 in this. Quite simple. China was number 1, Canada was number 2, and the United States was number 3. And I'm pretty sure you're wondering where African countries are. And you can see here that the African country that performed the highest on this ranking that we did was South Africa at 20, and then we've got Morocco and the DRC somewhere at 28 and 29. So clearly, there's a lot of space for Africa to improve upon its opportunity to move from the 11 billion to 7 trillion opportunity. But what would it take? So in order for us to really harness this opportunity and be able to look at the practical steps Africa need to take, I wanted to look at a very parallel industry. I wanted to focus on an industry that African countries have come to dominate, and then all of us collectively in this room will try to draw parallels between the battery industry and that particular industry. So I thought about what would be the most practical example, and I settled on this. Currently, African countries dominate what is called jollof. And how many of us know what jollof is? One, two, three, four, everyone. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, it's a meal very popular in West Africa, similar to what the Spanish call a paella, but not the same. And essentially, you cook rice in a sauce. And ever since, the age of time, 3 countries have been trying to dominate who makes the best jollof in the world. So there's Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal. So to put this to a final test, a law firm in the United Kingdom, in London to be specific, organized a competition among these 3 countries. And as you can see, it's Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal. And guess which country won? Hey, my friend. Where are the Nigerians? And if you cannot tell by my name, I'm Ghanaian, by the way. So, it's not bias. I'm an analyst. Ghana was number 1. Senegal was number 2. And my very good friends from Nigeria were number 3. So what is it that makes Ghana's jollof the best around the world? And I'm going to share 3 principles with you. So number 1, we think that Ghana has some of the best raw materials that they need in order to make the best jollof. And for those of you who would really want to put that to test, you can see me after, and I personally make sure I show you the secret sauce in terms of ingredients and raw materials that makes Ghana's jollof the best. The second one is that Ghana has got some of the best chefs. And when I talk about the chef is that person in the back end who brings all the raw materials together to ensure that they mix them in the right quantities in order for them to be delivered to your table. And then the final part of what makes Ghana's jollof some of the best in the world is what I call demand. Ghanaians are passionate about their jollof. You would never go to a Ghanaian event where they will sell all meals without a jollof. We love it, we promote it, and we make sure that there's a feedback loop. Because we buy, patronize, and purchase it, there is always a feedback that goes back to the raw materials, to the chef, and back to the table. So these are the 3 ingredients that I think has made Ghana's jollof some of the most competitive around the world. So now I want to take your brains off the dining table and bring it back to the battery industry. So what can Africa learn from Ghana's dominance of the jollof race? Now let's start with the first thing, raw materials. To be able to build a $7 trillion electric vehicle manufacturing industry, you need raw materials. It's as simple as that. And I think the previous speaker talked about the fact that Africa has, I think, about 30% of the current raw materials that the world needs in order to develop the battery value chain. And this is an area that Africa needs no introduction. There are countless companies I can talk about that are actually building these raw materials capability. The second thing is we need a chef, and I'm happy that a colleague will be sharing his experience in the battery industry. Without a chef that would take all these ingredients, whether it's cobalt or whether it's rice, whether it's a tomato sauce or whether it's nickel, and then be able to put it all together. And mind you, that is a $1 trillion industry. And beyond just having the right chef, there's actually one missing ingredient that Africa needs. You need demand. Imagine producing a product that nobody wants. Imagine producing a jollof that nobody wants to eat. So essentially, if Africa wants to build a battery value chain that transcends globally, Africa needs to create the demand for those batteries. And later on, I'll talk about how. So now we've talked about jollof. We've talked about the parallels we can draw between jollof and then batteries. What is Africa's competitive advantage? Let's go back to the raw materials. You can see that pretty much every metal needed to produce battery in the world is in Africa. Is it graphite? Is it cobalt? Is it graphite? Tanzania has it. Cobalt, the DRC has it. Copper, the DRC has it. Nickel, South Africa has it. Madagascar also has it. Zimbabwe has the lithium. So essentially, if it's about raw materials, which is the number 1 pillar to build a downstream value chain, the good news is that Africa has it. How about cost of producing the midstream, which is where the chef sits now? We did a study a few years ago, and we realized that, for example, if you take the DRC, they're actually one of the countries that could potentially produce the midstream products, the precursor product, at the lowest cost. And even beyond producing it at a low cost, they can actually produce it at very low emissions. So in terms of competitive advantage, if Africa wants to build the midstream, what happens in the kitchen where you put the ingredients together, what this study is essentially saying is that Africa has what it takes. And the final thing I'm going to talk about is demand. Remember that rankings that I showed you where a lot of European countries were actually on top? It's because they were able to incentivize demand. Remember how I talked about how passionate Ghanaians are about their jollof? For Africa to be able to harness that opportunity, Africans must be passionate about this transition. And I always use the low-hanging fruit where we don't have to be the next market for a Tesla Model 3 or for a VW ID4. Look around you. The tuk-tuk motorbikes and those three-wheeler means of transportation that dominates most of the cities, whether in Lagos or whether in Accra or even in Cairo. If all of these motors and tricycles would transition from internal combustion engine to electric scooters or electric tricycles, imagine the demand we will create for a local battery manufacturer like my colleague who will come on stage. So 3 things. If you forget anything that I talked about, number 1, we need to invest in raw materials. Number 2, we need to invest in the chef who put the raw materials together. And number 3, Africans need to be passionate about creating demand for these batteries. And I think I preempted that slide. That is a winning recipe. But I know it's an investor forum, so I wanted to leave you with 6 nuggets. I've talked about what developers can do. I've talked about what it takes for companies to build the value chain. How about a climate that supports investment for institutions like Afrexim to also get on the bandwagon? And like I said, I'm going to share really 6 nuggets quickly. Number 1, African institutions need to invest in projects. We are at the early stage of a transition where, for once in my lifetime, and I hope you're not guessing my age, America is not dominating an industry, Europe is not dominating an industry. Everyone is having the same, as we speak now, there's a parallel event on critical minerals happening in Europe now, in Brussels. And guess what they're talking about at this very moment? Africa's critical raw materials. So we are at a time in an industry where everybody's at the starting line. But then for Africa to have competitive advantage, Africa needs to take a stake in it. And I think the Afrexim 2 days ago made its commitment in investing in early stage projects as well as expansion projects to ensure that Africa has a foothold in this emerging industry. The second thing I want to touch on is growth demand. And I think I've already talked about the tuk-tuk as an example. Think about all these African countries where power is actually challenges at home. So there is solar, but then imagine if every solar panel came with a complementary lithium-ion battery installment as well to give power. So there is actually demand, but then we need to foster or jumpstart that demand, whether it's home battery or is that 2-3-wheeler batteries. The third thing I want to talk about is to build infrastructure. Every country that any investor goes into, first of all, they want to be able to see an airport where you can land. They want to see road that leads you to their project. They want to be able to have access to power that comes to their project. They want to be able to have a rail line that transports them to the port, their materials to the port, and they actually want a port that would enable them to connect to the world. So without these 5 critical infrastructure, it will be very difficult for Africa to build those bankable projects that investors are looking for. The fourth thing I want to talk about is local research. I started my first job in the university, and I'm always very passionate about the importance of developing research and skill capability. Imagine we're able to build all these downstream companies, but then there's no one to operate them, and we have to go get expatriates from Europe or the United States. That would not be right. It would defeat the purpose of Africa actually industrializing. So the time to actually start building the skills for tomorrow's battery industry is today, and that is why it's important that universities around the world, as well as high schools, jump on this and then invest in research and skill development. The fifth thing is fiscal certainty. It always helps because you're looking at billions and billions of investment, and that certainty for investment goes a very long way. And the final thing I want to talk about is good governance. Good governance goes a very, very long way to ensure that these projects are able to be delivered on time and on budget. And if we are able to do all these 6 things, the next time we do this ranking in 2030, it might not look like this, where it will be China, US, or Canada. It might look something like this. And I think we would all be proud of an Africa that dominates jollof and then also dominate the battery industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kwasi. No, I just had a follow-up question for you. If you can just answer it here, maybe. No, here at the lectern. No, I've got a question for you. No, 'cause you looked at that price competitivity in terms of precursor battery cells, and then in your last slide you said we need to make sure that we've got the infrastructure. Yeah. So ultimately, when you looked at the precursor battery cells, what assumptions were you making in terms of power and in terms of infrastructure costs, so transport costs, export costs, etc.? Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the assumptions that you made, sure, and whether you took into consideration that we don't necessarily already have the infrastructure, yeah, to get that unit cost of production competitive globally? Yeah.
So I think particularly for energy, I can talk about it. So we actually had to put a weighting on the electricity costs, given the fact that, so we made an assumption, I think specifically for this project, the client, in this case, the DRC government, was very optimistic about their power capacity. But then our assumption we ended up going with is that for you to be able to build this precursor project, we assume there's no power in that project-specific location. So it has to be co-located with a renewable energy power project. So there was a big weighting on top of that. However, where if you look at the logistics part, actually is going to be a very counterfactual argument here. So if you look at the DRC, and like I said, this was a project-specific analysis. So the particular location where the government was hoping to set this already has the logistical infrastructure. So there's a lot of trucks today that leaves Kolwezi and Lumumbashi in the DRC going to Durban, tracking rocks, right? So heaps and heaps of them, hundreds of them in a month. Here's the logic. If you're able to process the precursors from these rock materials, what happens actually, you reduce those trucks to about 25% of the current volume. So the volume of the materials you end up shipping becomes just 25%. So currently, from an infrastructure perspective, we are hoping that we are not even assuming any new additional infrastructure. You're actually converting it into precursor, lowers the burden on the logistical infrastructure, where they would just transport smaller materials to Durban or wherever they want to build those batteries. So to answer your question, we put a higher weighting on power, but then even despite the higher weighting we put on power in Africa, Africa still came out competitive.
Fantastic. Thank you. We've got questions, but unfortunately, we're running out of time, so you have to catch Kwasi after this session. So I'd like to bring to the lectern Mr. Deshan Naidu, who's the Managing Director of Akora, a battery manufacturer. So he's going to give us a very short presentation, then a Q&A, then we'll go and bring the panel to the stage. Round of applause for Deshan, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. So I think just leveraging off my colleague and his analogy, if we look at this integrated strategy, we'd say the midstream or the manufacturing of precursors on the continent, I would assume would be the sous chef, and what we are trying to do is become the master chef. And I'll conclude that a little bit later on. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce my project. It is called Akora, and the intention here is to create the intellectual property that is necessary to develop not one, but multiple gigafactories on the continent, because that's exactly what the opportunity is. A bit of background to myself, and I think this is important. You know, I've been reading a lot over the last 14 months, and one thing as African entrepreneurs we have realized is that we underplay the experience and the importance of our homegrown experience. So to give you context, I spent the better half of the last decade as CEO of an automotive component manufacturing facility that exports 99% of their products to developed markets, specifically Europe, UK, and US. And as a South African company, to compete on a global basis, supplying internal combustion engine parts to the world market was very, very difficult. The business was a turnaround strategy. We had to execute a significant investment into the business to try and grow it to that 99%. And it's something I'm very proud of. You know, when I joined that business, the average age in the plant was 55 years old, predominantly pale male. And when I stepped down as CEO and I sit on the board, it is now the average age in the plant is 34 years old, and the entire staff complement is 52% black female. So I think that is really noteworthy, and as a result of our strides that we made in that business, I was awarded the Youth Industrialist Export of the Year award by President Cyril Ramaphosa. I've also contributed to a few of the sort of the master plans, specifically the Critical Minerals Master Plan, as well as the New Energy Vehicle Master Plan, and through that process became one of the youngest board member at the Automotive Component Association of South Africa. And when I was looking at this business, and I said, we're producing internal combustion engine parts, this is a sunset industry, we really need to look forward, and I went and did this comprehensive analysis in terms of the new energy vehicle strategy, and eventually settled on the opportunity for cell manufacturing in Africa. So our mission is very simple: creating Africa's first gigafactory and hopefully using that as the entry point for more gigafactories. And the thought process is very similar to what Kwazi mentioned here. We've set up this business in terms of 3 operating divisions. One is the material supply, so that is the supply of raw material, not only to our partner ecosystem, but also to the global market. The second is in terms of AfriVault, which is the trademark that we own, and that is the actual cell manufacturing capacity. And the final element is the recycling of those materials. As you will see, virgin materials are decreasing in terms of the global market, especially given the ESG considerations in the West. And as a result, recycling becomes a very important consideration here. When we looked at the domestic market pain points, and these are not dissimilar from other industries, and this is specifically from a South African perspective, but it is the same across the continent. Currently, China produces roughly 77% of all cells globally, and the issues that we have in South Africa, and South Africa is on average importing about $1.7 billion on a rolling basis in terms of lithium-ion cells. So the domestic market that Kwazi was talking about exists. But the issue that they're facing is cash conversion cycle, high minimum order quantities, high levels of safety stock, and it really does sort of diminish their competitive advantage in terms of businesses and the commercial advantage when they have all this cash that is tied up in their supply chain. And when we went to the domestic market and pitched our project to them, it was extremely sort of satisfying to know that the conversation has been, yes, we will give you expressions of interest for offtake, as the first point, but more importantly, we'd like to be an equity participant in these projects. So that's how we've tried to de-risk this project as much as possible. I'm not going to talk to the slide in detail, but this is some analysis that was done by McKinsey, and I'm smiling because obviously Kwazi's from Bloomberg. But essentially what this talks to is the change in the contribution of the environmental footprint across the different sectors here. And if you notice at the bottom, cell manufacturing by 2030 is expected to be net zero in terms of their carbon footprint. And that, as a result, has increased the carbon footprint of all the other processing requirements. And this is really important because if you look at, as Kwazi mentioned, the location of the deposits of battery minerals, we can significantly reduce the carbon footprint of the entire electric vehicle battery train. And I think this is cemented by a simple quote by the actual founder of Tesla, and is the CEO of Redwood Materials, who said that from mine to the electric vehicle, these minerals travel more than 55,000 miles from source to the electric vehicle. So by co-locating mining, processing, and manufacturing on the continent, not only from a cost perspective can we be competitive, but we can further to that reduce the carbon footprint of the overall supply chain. So as I mentioned, the solution here is co-location, and the intention of our project is to develop, finance, and operate the first gigafactory in South Africa, and then supply battery materials to the global supply chain. Our technical partner that we have signed up, who's also an equity partner in the project, has a very interesting strategy. They're looking to set up gigafactories in markets that are not the primary focus of the large gigafactory brands. And this gives you an example of exactly where they have set up gigafactories, and you can see the significant projects that are underway. We are starting with 5 gigawatts, and the next slide will give you context as to why and what the opportunities are. So this is a very academic slide, but it talks to, from a total cost of production perspective, from a European standpoint, what are the largest cost contributors? And I'll just talk to it very highly. As we can see at the bottom, CapEx, energy, and labor are the largest contributors or determinants of the total cost. And if you break that down, it's 70% which is material on average, and 30% which is manufacturing. And as I say in my last point there, from a capex perspective, that's a result of scale. But secondly, from an energy and labor perspective, compared to European as well as US prices, we can be cost competitive from a manufacturing perspective. So how many gigafactories are needed globally? There's expected, and this is an analysis from Raystart Energy, there's going to be by 2030 a 5,000 gigawatt hour, more than 5,000 gigawatt hour gap between the forecasted demand and the supply. So globally, we're looking at more than 200 gigafactories that are required with an average output of 25 gigawatt hours. And Africa is the smallest, but we have the minerals, and there's been a lack of investment into this industry, and it's about time that this happens. This slide talks to why we chose South Africa, and the importance here, as Kwasi was speaking to, is government policy and the appetite to look at developing this in country. But the important points here, I think, is that South Africa is the most mature manufacturing market on the continent. There are 8 vehicle OEMs in country, and there's increasing appetite from government towards battery manufacturing, supporting the value chain, and from a fiscal perspective as well. So that is really, I think, the key point here, and that's the reason that we use this as our path to entry. So AfriVault 1 is the project that we're talking about. It is a 5 gigawatt facility. The thought process is that there are 3 phases to this. Phase 1, set up the manufacturing capacity for cells, but import all the raw materials. So prefabricated electrodes. Phase 2, to look at localizing the supply chain, and then phase 3 is building out the capacity in terms of that plant. And we are actively capital raising. So in the end, I think this is the intention to basically conclude what Kwasi was saying. If we are able to use renewable energy to produce or process these minerals, we can get sustainable minerals, convert that with an emulation strategy of not reinventing the wheel, but leveraging international strategic partnerships, and we can lead to catalyzing new jobs. And obviously the funding gap is the most important. And we'll talk to that in the fireside chat once I'm done. But the final point here is that, as I mentioned, in the midstream, you become the sous chef. In the cell manufacturing, you become the master chef. And at an investment conference like this, I'm hoping that this project can make me a Michelin star chef. Thank you very much.
So Deshan will join the panel. Alongside, it's my distinguished pleasure to welcome Daphne Nkosi, chairperson of Kalagadi Manganese, Mr. Duma Sisulu, co-founder and chief analyst at Parimi Battery Minerals, and Mr. Giv Munga, who's the group executive asset management and coverage at the Trade and Development Bank. Round of applause for our panelists. So, Deshan, a quick follow-up question. In terms of the off-taker in South Africa, who do you see that being? Is it the electrical vehicles market, or is it, are there other uses in terms of what you'll be producing?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. So in terms of the electric vehicle market, and like I said, I spent a lot of time analyzing or trying to analyze what is happening on the African continent with regard to the appetite for the assembly of electric vehicles. And unfortunately, it's extremely nascent at this point in time. There's no policy, there's not extreme policy certainty in terms of fiscal incentive to support new energy vehicle assembly. And as a result, the entire analysis that we have done, and we have de-risked the project by looking at stationary storage specifically. So we have already the expressions of interest for north of 3.5 gigawatt hours per annum. And that, from a commercial viability perspective, really does de-risk the project and ensure commercial viability.
And so we know that the big operators, the Glencores of this world, are very active on the continent. But the Northvolts, that were part of the presentation that Kwasi gave us, they're not making, or even the Teslas, they're not making big announcements on the continent. Why do you think that is?
I think it's this perceived risk associated with Africa. I feel this is something that we see all the time. We've been pitching to large family offices as well as private equity firms in the West, and some of them just do not have a mandate for Africa. It seems as if they class Africa as a black box, And I think that is the perceived geopolitical risk associated with it. Further to that, Northvolt, and given the fiscal incentives provided by the West and governments in the West, they are so busy developing gigafactories in their regions that they really don't have the capacity to look outside there. So I think those are the two fundamental issues as to why we're not seeing established battery manufacturers looking at Africa.
And what's the ticket size? I mean, how much are you looking for in terms of an investment? And who are you talking to? Are you talking to the DFIs to take that, to play that catalytic role to bring more, to crowd in more investors?
Yes.
What's the strategy in terms of on the finance side?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I've had to pivot the strategy so many times based on these issues that you see with financiers. So firstly, to answer the question, the ticket size, roughly, if you're looking at cell manufacturing in terms of capital investment, it's roughly around $100 million per gigawatt hour. That drops as you build capacity and the larger the facility. So in our 5 gigawatt hour project, our capital raise at this point in time is $450 million. And secondly, the question in terms of how we are actually trying to do this, it's via very much a piecemeal approach. We've been approaching DFIs as well as I mentioned, private family offices as well as private equity. The issue that we found with DFIs is that there's significant bureaucracy associated with their processes. And from an international financing perspective, again, given the perceived risk of Africa, their preference is to actually have an international holding company, as I showed on my slides, so that they do not want to make the investment directly into the continent or into the country. They'd rather do this from an international perspective, and they feel that would de-risk their investment. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Okay, I've got one more question in regards to the US market. Ultimately, so we've seen the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a bit of an oxymoron given that they're pumping a lot of money and creating inflationary pressures. But anyway, the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of subsidizing the electric vehicle markets, the gigafactories, etc., etc. But we've got an AGOA protocol that's been renewed. But AGOA looks at textiles, looks at other soft commodities, but it's not really looking at these new technologies. And people are calling for the AGOA agreement to be extended to include precursor batteries, so that we can integrate the U.S. market in terms of electric vehicles. I mean, what's your take there? Do you think this is achievable, or we're daydreaming again?
Yeah, that is I think is a very current question, and something that we've been dealing with our U.S. potential financiers as well. Now, the issue with the IRA is that the IRA stipulates that you get tax break by investing in a U.S. supply chain, or alternatively, countries that have a free trade agreement with the U.S. Now, the U.S. has basically shot themselves in the foot, because what they have done is that they have not included, as you mentioned, AGOA into this agreement. And in Africa, the U.S. doesn't have many free trade agreements with independent or individual countries. We have AGOA, which interestingly does include automotive components, and it doesn't specify the technology. So that is important. And I think if we're able to produce the value chain here, we have that benefit. The issue is that AGOA is not included in the IRA, and that will take some work to be done. It has to go back to Congress to obviously modify that agreement. So right now, yes, it does make a lot of sense, because the U.S. have cut themselves off in terms of this IRA benefit and the mineral supply from Africa. I do believe there will be a modification of that policy going forward, but the timeline is the one that is important, and that's where it's sort of clouded at this point in time.
I mean, interestingly, Morocco does have a free trade agreement with the US, and Morocco now, I believe, is neck and neck with South Africa in terms of car exports. And actually, it's neck and neck also with Poland in Europe in terms of car exports. So we've got actually I don't want to say a big automotive sector, but we've got a couple of big powerhouses in South Africa and in Morocco. But what's interesting about the Chinese example, actually, I was reading great articles in Bloomberg. So I'm actually publisher of African Business Magazine, but Bloomberg have written extensively on the EV markets. But actually, so today we see BYD, Build Your Dreams, that are some of the biggest, bigger than Tesla in terms of electric vehicles. But actually, it started off with 500 companies in the EV space that then consolidated to become these sort of big giants or global giants. But it was a very competitive marketplace that the Chinese created before creating these overnight success stories that took 20 years to grow and be what they are. Exactly. But it's a competitive environment that really got them to where they are today as leaders. If I may go to you, Daphne, I saw you occasionally nodding when you said, okay, yes, we should be producing locally because actually it will reduce the number of trucks that go from DRC to Durban. I also saw you shaking your head when we spoke about finance and DFIs and the bureaucracy that they sometimes come with. I mean, what's your comments in terms of the critical minerals and how we can actually play what strategic thinking do we need to be executing to make sure that we become global players?
Thank you very much, Omar. In terms of Africa, we need to have a strategic plan for what we call, or we term strategic minerals, which are the minerals that were actually presented by Bloomberg. That's the first point. The second point is that the tracks that you are talking about in terms of infrastructure development that we are trying to build for Africa, we've seen it with Transnet. We are the only ones in the Northern Cape that are actually beneficiating out of the 3.8 million tons that we produce, because when you beneficiate, 25% of that actually is beneficiated material, and therefore you bring down the cost of rail. For instance, we're able to free up space for junior miners who actually are now loading at our rapid loadout station because there's that space that we have created. If we're actually selling lumpy, which is raw material, we would have actually taken up the 3.8 million tons. And therefore, there wouldn't be space for 3 junior miners that would have trucked at very high costs. So for me, but also the trucks, what they do to the roads, the high accidents, they spend 2 weeks on the different borders, as you say, from Tanzania through to Zambia and so on and so forth. It's human beings that are actually also, taking a toll in terms of health issues that we as women are actually worried about. But for me, I think we need to have a plan for that. Manganese is a critical, and I saw the slide, and that's why I was actually looking at manganese being number 5 in terms of, we might not be there in terms of EVs, but we're actually very excited that even in 2050, we still be there. And one is looking at it from an EV point of view for today. I don't know what the technologies are, but as a miner in mining, looking at a solar plant of 200 megawatts, I'm still struggling with battery storage solutions that can actually allow me to produce the 200 megawatts because I'm 400 meters from a transmission line that I would probably produce the solar, but battery storage solutions so that I can actually form get a wheeling agreement with Eskom so that I can export what I don't use, because my sinter plant probably will take 40. A total of the mine, the sinter plant, and the ore preparation plant is 75 megawatts. So I have enough energy to actually, sell or export. So it's all those things that I think we are excited about. And I'm happy that I'm the oldest, I think, in the panel, and therefore young people like you would be able to take over and actually come with cleaner technologies, even with energy being the biggest challenge. And when they spoke about technology, I looked at South Africa and saying, we're sitting with 400 years of coal in South Africa. And the debate, the jury is still out there, whether we can still continue to use coal. It is still the cheapest form of energy. And with the challenges that we have of energy, we need people like you and Duma to actually look at cleaner technologies so that Africa can continue to use the coal that it has, because we have an abundance of coal in South Africa. And I'm defending that sitting here because I think Africa must actually use the cleanest form of energy. Whilst your environment is important, I want to repeat what I said in the other panel. Poverty eradication is critical.
Thank you. So if I understand correctly, you're saying that there's a lack of clear policy and the right policy to support private sector.
We have no clear plan in terms of supporting the private sector, but also planning for our strategic minerals. Lithium, vanadium, manganese, iron ore, all those that we actually need for battery storage solutions and EVs are sitting in Africa. And therefore, I do not yet see a strategy that is being driven aggressively in Africa to actually even classify those as strategic minerals so that we never, ever actually export them without beneficiating them.
So you agree with current policy in Zimbabwe and elsewhere in terms of not being able to export lithium in its raw state? You think that's what's needed? We need to have clearer policies and radical policies on that front?
Yes, I agree with that because I can give an example in manganese, for instance. When you export raw material, you export not only jobs, but high-end jobs, because processing of minerals require your engineers, your process engineers, and so on and so forth. So when you do export raw materials, you do export high-end jobs. And therefore, yes, I agree with the Zimbabwe policy.
Excellent. Thank you. And last question in terms of beneficiation. So what has been the struggle on your front in terms of manganese beneficiation and your beneficiation part of the business? Is it easier to extract than beneficiate? And if so, what have been the constraints?
I think if you look at our model, we always wanted to beneficiate. We've never sold an ounce of ore. It has been difficult for us because we have not been able, even when the price of Lampi was making it possible to actually even the small miners to make money, we always wanted to beneficiate. We have a sinter plant that is the largest manganese sinter plant in the world in terms of output. And therefore for us, we did not want to as a strategy. It has been very difficult. For instance, let me give you an example. If you look at, in the last 3 weeks, we've been visiting our clients in China. We're sitting with a stockpile of 6 million tons of raw manganese and only 200,000 tons of beneficiated manganese. And if you look at the Chinese economy, and then the unemployment rate in China is 5.2%, and the unemployment rate of South Africa at 60 million people versus China at 1.4 billion people, we're sitting at 38 to 40% unemployment rate because we do export the jobs, we don't actually create them. So, yeah.
Thank you, Daphne. So, I mean, you mentioned about mapping the critical minerals. So, Doom, I'm going to come to you in a second because I know that's what you're doing and you're focusing on the different minerals there. But I mean, I want to go to Gift if you don't mind, to talk about the issue of financing, which I believe is critical in terms of the investors. It's a very challenging global macroeconomic environment. Governments don't have they're fiscally constrained, so they can't play that catalytic role. And people are saying the role of multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, is going to have to change to really support, take more risk, be more proactive, be more agile to support our investors and our entrepreneurs and the business leaders.
Sure. No, thank you so much, Omar. I think this is a very important discussion, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. I think he talked about the bureaucracy that is within the DFI space, and I will talk to that. Now, I wanted to try and just also underline the importance of this discussion before then I get to the aspects of finance. So number one, I think the presentation by Kwasi was very clear. The opportunity in Africa, to drive our economies through, green minerals and green energy is massive. And I think, there is consensus, that if we do this properly, and rightly, we should be able to push, poverty alleviation, because then we get, significant revenues from, for instance, the sale of all these minerals that we're talking about, the cobalt, the lithium, the copper. But then we need also to make sure that we are mining it responsibly. We are very, kind to the environment, so that we can achieve this. Now, if we do this, like I said, rightly, it's going to be a very big driver for our economies in Africa. So there'll be job creation. We will be able to resolve the issues of income inequality. And, above all, obviously our governments, our countries will have, good, amount of revenues, for them to invest, in social investments and obviously push progress on the continent. So this is agreed and this is, obvious. Now, there are a few other issues that I think, in my view, we need to also, look at, and I needed to just point these out before then I touch on financing. So number one, I thought I could look at this from two, points. So number one, what do we need to do, as a continent? So probably at AU level and at country level. And then secondly, the financing part. So very quickly, in my view, we need to really have real conversations as a continent, especially maybe at AU level, and push regional collaboration and integration, because this is very key. And whatever it means, I'm not very sure, but I really think that it's important that we flip the priorities. We have two priorities, in my view. You have a political agenda and you have an economic agenda. Currently, I think most, times we push the political agenda, in a bigger way than we push the economic agenda. And I think we need to flip that and focus on how do we collaborate for shared prosperity. How do countries work together to do projects together? I think there is a talk of lithium projects in DRC. I understand Zambia and DRC, they are collaborating to put up a factory that's going to do, the processing there. These are the kind of, projects and initiatives that we need to do and achieve, so that, together we can push, this agenda towards poverty alleviation. We also need to probably, agree that, for this to happen, I think we also need to identify who are the players, that are critical in this whole process, for us to actualize, what we are trying to achieve. And then we must meaningfully engage, in all these conversations. How do we achieve this? We need to look at the process. Now, if we look at the value chain, we talked about the minerals, but in the value chain, we have also, the aspects, for instance, of clean energy. This is also very critical. I think it is estimated that 60% of the global, solar, resources are sitting within Africa. And, when this is harnessed, definitely it's going to improve the access to electricity in a big way and also reduce, the cost of generating, power. But we need to understand what's the process. How do we move? How do we decommission, the fossil, fuels and begin to ramp up, on the, renewables, to achieve what we want to achieve? And, once these conversations, have been done, it then obviously, fits into the aspect, that Omar now talks about, the aspect of financing. Now, this admittedly is a very big, part. I was reading somewhere that the International Energy Agency estimates that for Africa to actualize, this transition, to renewables, to green energy, would require about 200 billion annually, in investments to actually do this. Now, this is a very big, amount. It's a big figure. How do we do this? So, number one, it's extremely important, I think, for all of us. Like I said, at policy level, at government levels, to first of all understand, how do we get this financing going? So it's important, first of all, to ensure that collaborations, like we said, if we can set up partnerships and then we get countries to work together, it becomes also easy, for those countries to then, engage with institutions like ours, which are DFIs that are pushing, financing, for these projects. That's number one. We must also pursue, arrangements around public, private partnerships, because these are big projects, they need the money, and admittedly, we do not have all the money within ourselves, in Africa. But again, at AU level, I think we should also engage. There is climate finance, out there, and Africa has been getting quite very little, of that, money. So we must also explore avenues. How do we, get into this, space and get enough funding?
So sorry, Gift, I'm gonna interrupt you very quickly.
Sure.
So the thing about entrepreneurs is they try not to think about too many of the problems, otherwise they won't start the business. So they have an idea, they go for it, and then they'll solve the problems as they come along. If you try and think about all the problems, you'll never start the business. But my question to you is, I know TDB is actually one of the more agile DFIs out there. I know that you're very good at crowding in other capital, so from pension funds, etc. But do you see yourselves taking more risky, or I don't want to say risky bets or risky financing, but to finance people in the critical minerals sector or in the EV sector? So companies such as the Gigafactory that Deshan is trying to build in South Africa. I mean, is this sort of project that would interest you? And are you prepared? I mean, is the strategy changing to say, okay, we need to be bigger risk takers and act more like a commercial bank as opposed to like a DFI?
Sure. No, thanks so much, Omar. So, for TDB specifically, I think to talk about TDB, I think like you have said rightly, this is something that we have been doing. We have actually supported, in terms of financing of at least maybe 1,300 megawatts of installation in terms of capacity in our member states. And most of this actually has been, financing towards, green, projects. And so it's something that we are doing. Most recently, we have, started also embarked on a journey where we are developing, the funds strategy as well in a big way. And through the funds strategy, we are actually targeting investments, in these, green, projects to support, the investments that are, happening, I think like has been indicated here. So this is actually a very, sustainable way that we are actually exploring at the moment to crowd in, other financiers, and then to support projects, in solar. We're looking at lithium in Zimbabwe. We're looking at lithium and cobalt in DRC, and we have, already put in money in these projects. And we are definitely going to be accelerating on this agenda, even, for the years ahead.
And where on the value chain? So when you're saying lithium and cobalt, is it on the extraction side or on the beneficiation side?
So currently, we are actually looking at the whole value chain. So in Zimbabwe, basically we are supporting the country from extraction as they look at exports to China and so on and so forth. We are doing the same in DRC. We've just done some good funding in the cobalt mining opportunities. But then we're also looking at any trade finance related opportunities in the space.
And so, Deshan, in terms of your 450 million, so how much is it debt, how much is it equity, and are you speaking to the DFIs or you think it's too complicated for you?
It's interesting. So yeah, we have been speaking to quite a few DFIs. I think some of them are a lot more aggressive than others. I won't mention names, but for example, one DFI came back to me and said, well, it's a great project, we really believe in it, fits our mandate. We'll fund the bankable feasibility study, which is roughly around $10 million. But for that $10 million, they'll give us an uptick in terms of paid in capital from my perspective. And for that $10 million, they wanted 49% of the project. Now, in terms of valuation of a 5 gigawatt facility based on international multiples, you're looking at roughly around a $2 billion valuation. So for $10 million, they want 49% of the project, which is completely unrealistic. So those are some of the challenges that you face dealing with DFIs, overlaid with the bureaucracy. But I mean, the frustrating thing for me is the fact that this is an African project, right? And it's trying to catalyze what we want to do. The tagline for this event is creating the Africa we want. And ideally, what I want is to ensure that this is funded by an African organization, and that would be the ideal situation. So, yeah, definitely very keen to engage and see how we go forward. And Omar, we can discuss a capital raising fee on the side there.
All right. So Duma, if I can come to you. So Daphne said we need to be very strategic. We need to map the critical minerals where we've got a competitive advantage, and have a strategy there. So you're doing a lot of the mapping, and you're investing in some of the critical minerals. So tell us a little bit about your investment strategy, what's worked, what hasn't, and what plans you have.
Thank you. I'm co-founder of a company called Parima. Parima invests in battery metals. So we look at cobalt, manganese, copper, graphite, nickel, lithium, tantalum. Our investment strategy in the beginning was to map out all the assets that we can find across the continent, and then start engaging with them. The first approach we did was we went to the countries, went to the country offices, so all the departments of minerals and energy, etc. And what we got back was that the countries don't actually know what they have. They would give you a long list of all these names of assets, but when you start approaching and getting in touch with the people with these assets, you would find that they're very, very early stage. They just got a license, and they'd want to sell the license to you for $50,000, but the license has not been explored. They've not looked at any detail in it. They've not even picked up a rock and done a sample. So you start to realize that there's a gap, and what we believe that should have been done is that government should have provided the early stage exploration, geophysics of your entire country, so that each country knows what assets they have. It would make it a lot easier for investors like us when we can come and find the particular assets. So from that strategy, we had to then shift. And our shift, we began looking at key individuals in these countries. We started accessing our network. We're fortunate enough that I've had an uncle and my father were in mining for a long time, so they could direct us to people who we could assist us through the network and finding the geologists who've been working on these assets through the years. And from that approach, we were then able to find some assets. So we found a couple of assets that we're very interested in. We're in negotiations with them, and we will soon begin capital raising to acquire them. And when we acquire these assets, we're not just acquiring mines. We're looking to acquire mines and build processing capacity on top of it, but not to a precursor stage, just a stage before, so sulfates. So nickel, we're targeting building out nickel sulfate, and we'll sell those products individually. And in time, the ultimate goal is then to move towards precursor once you've acquired enough nickel sulfate and copper hydroxide that would justify building out the facility.
And do you get off-takers on the continent for that, or are your off-takers out of Africa, so elsewhere?
All the off-takers we've had discussions with, particularly in pre-funding, are all out of Africa. The interesting thing, we're finding that the OEMs are starting to come further down the value chain. We've had discussions with OEMs where they are saying, we want to get involved earlier stage, we want to sign off-takes with you from mine. So from mine, we will sign off takes with you. We will provide a small piece of the funding, but you're required to meet our specifications, and then you would complete the capital raise. So that's what we're finding, which is very interesting. We've not seen this before, so it's a very exciting time for us. But there is still a requirement for funding from DFIs, et cetera, which were more concessionary financing, to balance out when you do your capital raise.
So what you're saying is it's easier to get financing to extract than it is to get financing if you're beneficiating, which is counterfactual. Well, it goes against what Kwasi was telling us, because the real value is further down the value chain. But it's tougher to get financing further down the value chain because it's more risky. That's what you're saying, because there are not enough off-takers out there.
So it's a bit of both. The risk, the funding is a lot easier to find funding just for your raw materials. It's a situation where off-takers would prefer to get your raw materials out the ground and get it sold quickly. when you start adding complexity and risk into it, you're less likely to sign an off-taker. The off-takers are more closer to looking for, be able to turn cash. So if I can buy a product today and I can sell it tomorrow, you're a lot more likely to get a prepayment. If you tell them I need to build a gigafactory, they'll say, oh, that's a great idea, and you'll have long discussions with them, but you are a long way from getting capital out of them.
Okay, so it's that longer term capital that's
Yeah.
longer tenures are tougher to get.
For mining projects, Auntie Daphne will be able to tell you, you're looking at 15, 20 years to develop an asset. And then you have another 5 to 7 years to put in processing capacity on top of that. So the longer the project is, the further away you are to money, and the more stable money you require, the less, you don't want to be working with private equity and venture capital for when you're trying to build a mine, because of the timelines, you're very far from cash. You need very patient capital in order to finance mining. And that's one of the challenges we find, that early mining is high risk, and you need private equity money or venture capital money to do exploration, because it's not bankable yet. To get to bankable feasibility, that's going to take you 7 years. But when you're at bankable feasibility, you're not producing cash. You still require to do further developments. And that's the challenge you find between the cash available and the cash you really require, the capital you require.
And so what would you say is stopping you from growing your business at a faster pace? Is it the policy? So lack of clear vision and strategy from the policymakers in the countries that you operate in, and in terms of making sure that we own the value chain, or is it lack of capital? What's stopping you from growing more quickly?
Well, currently the first challenge is capital. Mining is incredibly capital intensive, and as you've seen in Kwazi's slides, the revenue might go up as you go further along the value chain, but so does the capital amount. And capital raising for a gigafactory, for example, is a 10x to then capital raising for a mine. And this is where you find the challenge of capital. You require a lot of capital to build a mine, but you also require a lot of capital to beneficiation. You require a lot of capital then to get involved in the entire value chain.
So the returns are bigger, but obviously it's a bigger investment to get to those returns.
Certainly.
Hence why we're still lagging behind, and only really playing a major role in that extractive element of the value chain.
Yeah, that's how we see it. It's almost your capital tends to go for the lowest risk options. Mining is risky enough, so when you have mining and you're trying to put some development on top of that, or you're looking to put processing on top of that, it adds to the complexity, and that adds to the challenges of you raising capital.
Okay, and so the closing words will be to the wisest person on this panel, which is Daphne. And Daphne, biology doesn't equate with energy. So we know that you're probably the most energetic out of all of us on this panel. But ultimately, in terms of you know the industry well. You've seen what works and what doesn't. But in terms of the critical minerals, with what you're seeing right now, are you optimistic in terms of the African continent being able to play an important role in the critical minerals space, and in terms of gigafactories, EV, supplying the EV markets out there?
Yes, I am. I think I'm very excited. And my fellow panelist from the DFIs has actually made me more excited by actually saying we need to begin to encourage the AU and the countries to actually deal with some of this critical mineral story. But the second point that I want to say is that countries from Africa must also invest in the DFIs, because we've been complaining about DFIs. The one who pays the piper chooses the tune. And if you look at some of the development funding institutions, you look at the shareholders of those development funding institutions, it's not African countries. Even those that had invested initially, they have diluted. And therefore, we can talk about development funding institutions funding development in Africa, but for as long as we do not take the decision at that level, we will not develop this continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Warm round of applause to all my panelists. I'm not sure if there's jollof rice on the menu, but there's definitely lunch being served. Thank you.
Sorry, can we go to the lunch one way?
Just one question. Because I think it's important that we have an exchange. Is there a speaker?
But feel free to speak. Feel free to wrap.
Microphone. This one here. Thank you so very much. Ma'am, you spoke our mind here. Your last comment is absolutely crucial. If we are going to develop Africa, by the way, my name is Patrick Odiego. I'm a miner in Nigeria. DRC is doing very well. South Africa is doing very well. Nobody mentions Nigeria. I started a mining operation, and I did total coverage. From thinking 2 years ago in Durban, South Africa, that I had maybe two veins, to realizing that I have over 20 veins. I've carried out some appraisal hole drilling, taking the sample to Canada, MS Lab in Canada, to discovering that we have over 61 different elements, ranging from base metal, industrial mineral, critical minerals, name it, it is there. And nobody mentions Nigeria. Now,
They did yesterday. You've come one day late. We've been talking about the automotive industry. What they said was that they've started a pilot in DRC and Zambia with a view to expand that into the other regions. So go and talk to African Bank, speak to AFCFTA. Those are your allies. They will help with the development of anything that you're raising now.
okay, thank you very much. You know, the schedule has been really, really bad, because you are definitely good. And also we have a exhibition at Nigerian Pavilion. You can come and see the product that we have. It's absolutely amazing. So, Mama, I agree with you. We need to be intentional in development of Africa. We can't be, I love what my brother is doing, and we are going to find a way to work together here in Africa to develop Africa. Thank you.
In Tunisia, we call that a statement rather than a question. But we love our Nigerian brothers. So a group photo.